move to economy now. The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin louder than it needed to. Heads turned. A man in a charcoal suit lowered his newspaper. A woman near the front paused with a flute of champagne halfway to her lips. Across the aisle, someone quietly lifted a phone and started recording. Marcus Reid looked up slowly from his tablet. He had already shown his boarding pass at the gate. He had shown it again at the aircraft door. Now, less than 4 minutes after settling into seat 2A, he was being asked for it a third time. "Of course," he said. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Derek Holloway, the lead flight attendant on Meridian Atlantic Flight 11E, took the boarding pass between 2 fingers like it might be counterfeit. He turned it under the cabin light, studying it as if searching for a flaw that wasn't there. Atlanta to Seattle. First class. Seat 2A. Every detail correct. Still, Derek didn't hand it back right away. Marcus watched his eyes travel, from the ticket to the worn canvas backpack tucked under the seat, to Marcus's plain dark jeans, to the simple black watch on his wrist. No gold logo. No tailored blazer. Nothing that screamed money the way Derek apparently needed it to. Derek's mouth tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "There may have been a booking error," he said. "There wasn't." Marcus knew there wasn't. He'd checked his confirmation 4 times that morning out of habit, not doubt. "We're still finalizing our seating checks," Derek said, finally releasing the boarding pass. Marcus nodded once and returned to his tablet. Around him, the cabin slowly resumed its rhythm. Ice clinking in glass, overhead bins clicking shut, a soft piano track drifting from the speakers. But the tension in the air didn't dissolve. It just went quiet, the way a held breath goes quiet. It had started the second Marcus stepped onto the plane. At the door, Derek had greeted the passenger ahead of him like an old friend. "Welcome back, Mr. Thornton. Your usual scotch is already poured." Warm, familiar, practiced. Then Marcus stepped through the door, and Derek's smile lost half its wattage. "Seat 2A, Derek had said flatly. No welcome aboard. No offer to help with the bag. Just a look, quick, assessing, dismissive, that said more than any sentence could have. Marcus had seen that look before. In hotel lobbies was where he was mistaken for staff. In private clubs where his membership card got double-checked while a stranger's didn't. In office building elevators where people assumed he was there to deliver something, not to run something. He'd learned a long time ago not to react too fast. Anger, even justified anger, had a way of becoming evidence against the person being mistreated. Calm did something else entirely. It forced the other person to sit alone with their own behavior, with nowhere to hide. So Marcus sat. He opened his tablet, he watched. A flight attendant offered champagne to every passenger in the first 2 rows, except him. She walked right past his seat without slowing. Another crew member checked his seat number twice, even though it was printed in plain block letters directly above his head. Small things, easy for anyone else to dismiss. Much harder to ignore once you noticed they formed a pattern. What none of the crew knew, what nobody on that entire aircraft knew, was that Marcus had booked this exact flight for a reason. For 8 months, Reid Ashcroft Capital had been quietly fielding complaints about Meridian Atlantic Airlines. Passengers describing the same thing over and over. Extra scrutiny, cold treatment, being made to feel like intruders in seats they'd paid full price for. And the common thread running through nearly every single complaint was race. Most of those complaints vanished into an internal review system, built, it seemed, to make sure nothing ever really got reviewed. No consequences, no accountability, just polite form letter apologies and silence. Marcus intended to find out why, because Marcus Reid wasn't just a frequent flyer with a chip on his shoulder. He was the founder and chief executive officer of Reid Ashcroft Capital, the single largest institutional shareholder in Continental Skyline Holdings, the parent company that owned Meridian Atlantic Airlines outright. He could remove executives. He could rewrite policy. He could trigger a company-wide investigation with a single phone call. But power revealed too early changes how people behave. It makes them perform decency instead of practicing it. So Marcus had flown alone. No assistant, no announcement, no security detail trailing 3 rows back. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, how an ordinary passenger got treated when nobody in the building believed that passenger mattered. Near the galley, Derek leaned in and whispered something to another flight attendant. Both of them glanced toward seat 2A. Marcus saw it. He also noticed the tall man in a slate gray suit, now making his way down the aisle behind them. Silver cufflinks catching the cabin light, an expression already curdling into irritation before he'd even reached his row. The man stopped cold in the aisle, his eyes locked on Marcus, then flicked up to the seat number printed above him. "Excuse me," he said, sharp enough to carry. "Why is someone sitting in my seat?" The cabin went still all over again. Marcus closed his tablet slowly. Derek straightened his uniform, like a soldier snapping to attention. And in that quiet, electric second, before anyone fully understood what was about to happen, Marcus understood that the real test of this flight had only just begun. Grant Whitfield didn't wait for an answer. He stepped in closer, filling the aisle with the easy, entitled confidence of a man who had spent decades being accommodated without ever once being told, "No." "That's 2A, he said. "I sit there every single Thursday." Derek moved toward him immediately, his whole posture shifting. "Mr. Whitfield." "Welcome aboard, sir." The warmth in his voice was instant, almost jarring. Marcus noticed it, so did the woman across the aisle, whose eyebrows lifted just slightly over the rim of her glass. "We're handling a seating matter right now," Derek told Grant, already reassuring him before anything had actually been resolved. Grant looked at Marcus again. Slower this time, more deliberate, cataloging him piece by piece. The plain shirt, the jeans, the scuffed backpack under the seat. His expression shifted from confusion into something closer to judgment. "There's clearly been a mistake," Grant said. Marcus stayed seated, his voice even. "My boarding pass says 2A. Grant gave a short, dry laugh. "That may be what it says, but this seat is tied to my traveler profile. Every Thursday. Ask anyone." Marcus turned to Derek. "Is that true? Does his preference override a confirmed reservation?" Derek hesitated, his eyes darting toward the front galley, like he was hoping backup would materialize out of thin air. "Mr. Whitfield is one of our Platinum Circle members. He's flown this exact route for 11 years. "That wasn't my question." The cabin seemed to lean in. Marcus's tone hadn't risen even slightly, but something in its flatness made Derek's shoulders go rigid. Marcus said, "Whether his preference overrides my confirmed seat." Derek swallowed. "Sir, we can offer you an alternative seat in first class." "Which one?" Derek checked his tablet. 3D. Marcus glanced down the aisle. 3D was open. Yes, but it sat directly beside the galley, inches from the lavatory door, tucked beneath an overhead crew storage bin that would be opened and slammed shut throughout the entire flight. Grant followed his gaze and shrugged. "It's still first class. You're not losing anything." Marcus looked back at him without blinking. "Then you take it." A ripple moved through the nearby rows. Someone coughed. The woman with the phone lowered it for a beat, visibly caught off guard by how simple and how devastating the answer had been. Grant's jaw locked. "I don't sit in 3D. I didn't purchase 3D. Neither did I purchase the right to give up what I did buy," Marcus said, "just because someone else prefers it." Derek stepped in closer, trying to referee. "Mr. Reid, we're only trying to avoid delaying departure." "I'm not delaying anything," Marcus said. "I'm seated. My bag is stored. My seatbelt is fastened. The only thing standing in the way of departure right now is this conversation. And I didn't start it." Derek's face hardened. "You're refusing a direct request from the flight crew." "No. I'm refusing to hand over something I paid for because another passenger would rather have it." The words landed clean and final. Grant's breathing changed, shorter, tighter. His knuckles whitened around the handle of his briefcase. Do you have any idea how much money I bring this airline every single year? Marcus paused. There was no anger on his face. Only something quieter. Something closer to disappointment. That shouldn't matter, he said. It matters to the airline, Grant snapped back. Marcus looked slowly around the cabin. At the passengers watching from behind raised phones. At Derek standing beside Grant. Instead of standing between the two of them like a neutral party should, at all the unwritten rules nobody on this plane would ever admit out loud actually existed. Then maybe, Marcus said quietly, that's the real problem. Derek's eyes narrowed. Sir, I need you to cooperate. I am cooperating. With every legitimate safety instruction given to me today. This is a crew instruction. No, Marcus said. This is a customer's preference, dressed up to look like one. The sentence changed the temperature of the whole cabin. Derek felt it land. So did Grant. Their authority hadn't vanished, but it had just been exposed for exactly what it was. From 2 rows back, an older woman spoke up, unprompted. He has a valid boarding pass. I can see it from here. Her husband touched her arm, trying to quiet her. She shook him off. I'm only saying what everyone in this cabin can already see. Grant's face flushed red. This is absurd. I have a 9 a.m. meeting in Seattle. I don't have time for some man trying to make a point. Something flickered across Marcus's expression for the first time. Not quite anger. Something older and quieter. A trace of pain, quickly folded back into stillness. Not because of the insult itself, but because he'd heard some version of that sentence his entire life. Some man. Some outsider. Someone who clearly doesn't belong here. He took a slow breath before answering. I'm not trying to make a point, Mr. Whitfield, he said, his voice dropping lower. I'm trying to keep one. Derek reached for the crew phone on the wall and requested the cabin manager. Marcus understood, watching him do it, that this had stopped being about who sat where. It had become about who this airline believed deserved to be heard at all. And who it had already decided didn't. The cabin manager arrived from the forward galley within a minute. Tablet pressed against her side, moving fast but composed. Priya Anand's uniform was immaculate. Her expression carefully neutral in the way that comes only from years spent walking directly into other people's conflicts. What seems to be the issue? Derek answered before Marcus could open his mouth. Mr. Whitfield's usual seat was assigned to Mr. Reid. We offered Mr. Reid an alternate seat in first class, and he's declined to cooperate. Priya's eyes moved first to Grant's tailored suit, then to Derek. Only after that did they land, briefly on Marcus. Mr. Reid, I do apologize for the inconvenience. There's no inconvenience on my end, Marcus said. I'm sitting in the seat printed on my boarding pass. Priya blinked, caught slightly off guard. Grant exhaled sharply beside her. This has gone on long enough. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. We'll get this resolved for you, Mr. Whitfield. The difference in her tone was subtle, but not subtle enough. Warmth for Grant, management for Marcus. Everyone nearby heard it. She opened her tablet. We can move you to 3D and offer a $200 travel credit. Marcus studied her for a moment. Why are you offering that to me? We're trying to accommodate both passengers. You're only asking one passenger to give something up. Her fingers stopped moving across the screen. Grant shifted his weight beside her. I've flown this route for 11 years, he said again. Like repetition might eventually make it a legal argument. Everyone here knows I sit in 2A. Marcus turned to face him fully. Your history doesn't erase my reservation. You're making this far more difficult than it has to be. No, Marcus said. I'm making it visible. The words cut cleanly through the recycled cabin air. A phone camera somewhere behind them tilted a little higher. Priya noticed, and her professional smile flickered, just barely. Mr. Reid, let's keep this from becoming a bigger issue. It became a bigger issue the moment your staff decided his comfort mattered more than my confirmed ticket. Derek stepped forward, defensive. That's not what happened. Marcus looked directly at him. You checked my boarding pass 3 separate times. You skipped me during the drink service. You offered another passenger my seat before you even asked whether I'd agree to it. And now you're calling my refusal non-compliance. Derek's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The older woman across the aisle nodded slowly, arms crossed. Her husband had stopped trying to quiet her entirely. Priya lowered her voice, leaning in like they were negotiating a hostage situation. We can raise the travel credit to $500. We can add 25,000 loyalty miles. Marcus studied her face. She genuinely believed every principle had a price tag. She just hadn't found his yet. This isn't a negotiation, he said. Everything in customer service is a negotiation, Grant muttered. Marcus turned to him slowly. That might be how people like you experience the world. Grant's eyes widened. People like me? People who confuse being accommodated with being entitled. The cabin went dead silent. Grant took a step closer, his breathing heavier now, his voice dropping into something meant to intimidate. You need to watch your tone. Marcus didn't move an inch. My tone is calm. You're the one being insulting. I'm simply describing your behavior. Priya raised a hand between them. Gentlemen, that's enough. It wasn't enough. Not anymore. Grant jabbed a finger toward Marcus's backpack. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you clearly don't understand how premium travel actually works. Marcus's gaze dropped to the finger, then rose again, unbothered. I understand it perfectly well. Grant gave a short, cold laugh. Do you? Something old opened in Marcus's chest, quiet, familiar, not dramatic. He thought, for just a second, of his father, who'd worked double shifts at a steel fabrication plant for 30 years and still put on a pressed jacket every Sunday morning, because he'd always said dignity should never be tied to a paycheck. He thought of the sentence his father repeated to him more times than Marcus could count. Respect isn't something powerful people hand you. It's something no one has the right to take away. Marcus's voice softened, but didn't waver. Mr. Whitfield, you could end this in about 2 seconds. Grant frowned. How? Sit in the seat that's actually printed on your boarding pass. Grant just stared at him. The answer was too simple, too fair. That, Marcus understood, was exactly why Grant hated it. Priya's tablet chimed. She glanced down, read the message, and her expression shifted. Just barely, but Marcus caught it. The gate manager had been notified. Airport security was standing by. She looked up. Mr. Reid, I need a final answer. Will you move voluntarily? Marcus reached down and pulled his talatodor. The click echoed sharp in the quiet cabin. No, one word. Steady. Final. Derek reached for the crew phone again, and near the back of first class, a woman quietly rose from her seat. Yolanda Briggs didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped into the aisle. Excuse me. Every head turned. Derek looked irritated. Ma'am, please return to your seat. Yolanda reached into her handbag and pulled out a laminated company badge, holding it up just long enough for Priya to read it clearly. I work for Meridian Atlantic. Derek frowned. I know exactly who you are. I don't think you do, Yolanda said calmly. I'm a flight attendant based out of Charlotte. I'm off duty today. But company policy doesn't stop applying just because I'm a passenger. Priya's expression shifted. Yolanda, this isn't your flight. No, but it's my airline. A heavy silence dropped over the cabin. Grant crossed his arms. Unbelievable. Now another employee wants to waste everybody's time. Yolanda ignored him completely, her eyes locked on Priya. Has Mr. Reid violated a single safety instruction? Priya hesitated. No. Has he refused to show identification? No. Has he occupied a seat that doesn't belong to him? No. Yolanda nodded once. Then what exactly is the justification for asking him to move? Derek jumped in before Priya could answer. We're trying to prevent a customer service situation from escalating. Yolanda's eyes never left him. No. You're creating one. The words landed harder than anyone expected them to. Derek's jaw tightened. "You're speaking without the full picture." "I've had the full picture since boarding," she said. "I watched his pass get checked 3 times. I watched drink service skip him entirely." She turned to Marcus for the first time. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this." Derek crossed his arms defensively. "You're making assumptions." "I'm describing what I observed," Yolanda said flatly. Several passengers exchanged glances. The older woman near the window spoke up again. "She isn't wrong." A voice joined in from a few rows back. "I noticed it too." A businessman closed his laptop. "He's the only one who's been asked twice whether he actually belongs up here." The cabin was shifting. People who'd stayed quiet were starting to speak. Not loudly, just honestly, the way a room slowly tilts. Once enough people stop pretending they don't see what's happening. Grant looked around, genuinely stunned. "You're all taking his side?" "No," the businessman said. "We're taking the side of fairness." Grant let out an impatient breath. "This airline knows me." "That shouldn't matter," Yolanda said before anyone else could. "It absolutely matters," Grant snapped. She looked at him, and for a moment, something almost sad crossed her face. "My father flew cargo planes for 31 years. He used to tell me the same thing after every single trip." She paused, letting the cabin settle into silence around her. "The safest cockpit is the one where every voice can be heard. The same is true for every cabin on this plane." Nobody interrupted. Even Derek went quiet. "If employees start deciding whose rights matter based on how someone looks or what status they carry," Yolanda continued, "eventually they'll start deciding whose safety concerns matter, too." That sentence hung in the recycled air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Priya looked away, and, for the first time since arriving, real uncertainty crossed her face. She understood, in that moment, that Yolanda wasn't talking about a seat anymore. She was talking about culture. About the small, quiet decisions that quietly calcify into policy because nobody ever pushes back hard enough to stop them. Derek reached for the interphone again. "This conversation is over." "No, it isn't," Yolanda said, and he actually stopped. "You've worked here almost 18 years. I have. Then you know the manual. You know we cannot force a passenger to surrender a confirmed seat simply because another customer prefers it." Grant let out a short laugh. "You're quoting policy at me?" "Yes." "Because policy doesn't understand loyalty points, Mr. Whitfield. Real loyalty isn't built by handing out special treatment." She looked at him steadily. "It's built by treating every single person with the same dignity, whether they're famous or invisible." The words seemed to echo through the quiet cabin. Marcus had said almost nothing for several minutes. He simply watched. Watched Derek's certainty crack down the middle. Watched Priya start silently, reconsidering every decision she'd made in the last 15 minutes. Watched strangers who'd boarded this plane as nobody to each other slowly become witnesses to something larger than a seat dispute. Outside the window, afternoon sun caught the edge of the wing. Ground crews kept loading baggage below. The plane sat there, still tethered to the jet bridge, departure time slipping further and further away. Derek finally exhaled. "I'll call airport security." Nobody reacted with much surprise. Yolanda gave a small nod. "If that's your decision, you'd better be ready to explain exactly what safety violation you're reporting." Derek opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because there wasn't one. And for the first time since this whole thing started, he understood he might soon have to justify his choices to people who cared a lot less about a passenger's status and a lot more about what was actually written down in black and white. And Marcus, sitting quietly in seat 2A, understood that the conversation had reached the exact point where truth was finally starting to outweigh authority. Airport security arrived without much urgency, but their presence still changed the air in the cabin. The second they stepped through the door, Officer Rashid Malik came first, 2 uniformed colleagues trailing behind him. Radios crackling low, boots striking the floor with slow, deliberate weight. Passengers lowered their voices. Phones stayed raised. Rashid's eyes moved from Derek to Priya to Marcus in seat 2A. "What's the situation?" Derek answered fast. "This passenger is refusing a crew instruction and delaying our departure." Rashid's gaze settled on Marcus. He saw a man sitting upright, seatbelt fastened, hands resting calmly in plain view. No shouting, no sudden movement, no threats. Rashid had handled real disturbances before: drunk passengers, screaming arguments, people who genuinely ignored safety rules. This didn't look anything like those. What instruction did he refuse? Derek's mouth tightened. A seating reassignment. For what reason? Derek hesitated. Grant stepped forward instead. "This is my regular seat. I've been sitting there for years." Rashid looked at him evenly. "Is your name printed on the boarding pass for 2A?" Grant's face stiffened. "That's not the point. It's actually most of the point," Rashid said. Priya moved closer, lowering her voice. "Mr. Whitfield is one of our highest status customers. We were only trying to accommodate his preference." Rashid glanced toward Marcus. "And your boarding pass?" Marcus handed it over without a word. Rashid checked the name, the route, the seat assignment. Everything valid. He checked Marcus's ID next. It matched perfectly. Then he turned back to Derek. "This passenger is assigned to 2A. The crew has the authority to manage seating for operational reasons," Derek said sharply. "Not because one customer wants another customer's seat," Yolanda said from the aisle. Derek rounded on her. "You need to stop interfering." Rashid raised a hand. "She's got a point." The cabin fell still. He continued. "I can remove a passenger who's threatening the crew, refusing a lawful safety direction, or creating an actual disturbance." He handed Marcus's documents back to him. "I cannot remove a calm passenger simply because he won't give up a seat he legally paid for." Grant stepped closer, his voice climbing. "This is absurd. I personally know senior leadership at this airline." Rashid's expression didn't shift an inch. "That doesn't change what's printed on his ticket." Grant's cheeks reddened. "You people are turning a simple request into a public spectacle." Marcus looked up at him, unhurried. "No, Mr. Whitfield. The spectacle started the second everyone in this cabin decided the easiest fix was to move me." Grant opened his mouth, but Marcus kept going. "You were already offered another first-class seat." "That's different." "Why?" Grant froze. The answer was somewhere inside him. But he couldn't force it into words, because saying it out loud would have meant admitting that years of special treatment had convinced him his preference and his rights were the same thing. Nobody had ever made him question that before today. Priya looked down at her tablet, her shoulders sinking slightly. "What if we offer Mr. Reid $1,000 in credit and 50,000 miles?" Marcus's expression showed no satisfaction, only something quieter and sadder. "You still think this is about the price?" Priya's fingers tightened around the edge of her tablet. "What happens," Marcus asked slowly, "to the passenger who can't afford to fight?" The question traveled farther than anything said before it. It touched something quiet in the cabin. An older man near the aisle looked down at his own hands. A woman in row 4 wiped quickly at one eye. Yolanda watched Marcus with something close to genuine respect, because she understood now that he wasn't defending a luxury seat. He was defending the idea that dignity shouldn't depend on someone's bank account, their connections, or their ability to argue confidently under pressure. Derek seemed to feel the room tilting further away from him. He straightened, grasping. "Perhaps we should verify his loyalty status." Marcus turned to him. "Why? To understand the full customer profile. You already understand everything you need to." Derek's voice went colder. "Sir, if you're truly a long-time traveler, there shouldn't be an issue confirming it." There it was again. Another test. Another demand for proof he shouldn't have needed to provide in the first place. Marcus reached slowly into the inside pocket of his backpack and placed a matte black card flat on the armrest. Priya saw it first. The color drained from her face. Derek leaned in closer, and his breath caught. The card displayed Meridian Atlantic's highest invitation-only tier, Founders, Circle Infinite. Marcus had logged over 9 million lifetime miles. Grant stared at it. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Marcus picked the card back up. I didn't show this earlier, because it shouldn't have mattered in the first place. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. You decided I deserved less respect before you ever saw it. Derek's breathing went shallow. Priya looked away, and at the front of the cabin, a silver-haired man in a dark navy suit slowly rose from seat 1C. Douglas Farrow, Meridian Atlantic's vice president of customer experience, had heard every single word. Douglas stepped into the aisle and straightened his cuffs. A small motion, but its effect on the cabin was anything but small. Derek recognized him first, and his whole face changed. Mr. Farrow, Priya turned, and for a brief second her polished composure completely slipped. Douglas wasn't just another passenger with money. As vice president of customer experience, he was, quite literally, the person who wrote every service standard the crew had spent the last 20 minutes claiming to protect. He looked at Marcus, then at the black membership card resting in his palm, then at the sea of phones still recording from nearly every row. I've been listening for several minutes, Douglas said, his voice low and even. Derek straightened. Sir, there's been a misunderstanding. No, Douglas said. There's been a series of decisions. Derek swallowed hard. Grant stepped forward, visibly relieved. Doug, thank God. You know me. Tell them I always sit in 2A. Douglas's gaze shifted toward him. I do know you, Mr. Whitfield. Relief crossed Grant's face, right up until Douglas kept talking. I also know your boarding pass doesn't say 2A today. The relief vanished instantly. So that's it? Grant said. After everything I spend with this airline, you're spending, Douglas said, his tone level and absolute, doesn't give you ownership of another passenger's seat. The cabin went silent again. Grant looked around, clearly expecting someone, anyone, to back him up. Nobody did. Douglas turned to Marcus. Mr. Reid, I owe you an apology. For what? Marcus said, holding his gaze. Douglas paused. The question forced him to actually be specific instead of vague. For the repeated scrutiny. For attempting to remove you from a confirmed seat. For the way my staff treated one passenger's status as more important than another passenger's rights. Marcus nodded, just barely. That's closer. Derek's jaw tightened, humiliation crawling up his neck. But underneath the embarrassment was something sharper. Fear. Not fear of losing an argument. Fear of losing control of the story entirely. Mr. Farrow, we were only trying to accommodate a loyal customer. Douglas turned on him sharply. At the expense of another loyal customer, Derek's eyes flicked toward Marcus's black card. Douglas caught it instantly. No, don't look at the card. Derek froze. Look at the passenger. The words landed hard. If Mr. Reid had no status at all, Douglas continued, would his boarding pass be any less valid? Derek didn't answer. Priya lowered her eyes to the floor. Near row 4, Yolanda stood quietly, hands folded, having finally heard someone with real authority say out loud what the crew had spent the entire flight refusing to admit. Douglas looked at her. You spoke up? Yes, sir. Thank you. Derek's face flushed. Sir, she interfered with an active crew matter. Douglas's voice went cold. She prevented a bad decision from turning into a much worse one. Reid watched quietly from near the aircraft door, his 2 colleagues relaxing slightly behind him. The threat of a forced removal had passed, but the humiliation in that cabin was only just getting started. Grant exhaled loudly. Can we please leave now? Douglas turned to him. You'll be taking seat 3D. Grant blinked. You cannot be serious. I am. And you're welcome to call Ronald Castellan after the flight if you'd like to discuss it further. Grant's face went dark. You understand what this airline risks by treating me this way. Douglas held his stare, unshaken. We risk far more by treating other people like they matter less. For the first time all day, Grant had no answer. He picked up his briefcase and moved stiffly toward R3, every eye in the cabin tracking him, not with satisfaction, but with quiet recognition. They were watching entitlement finally meet a wall it couldn't talk its way through. Douglas turned back to Marcus. "You'll remain in 2A. That was always the correct outcome." "Yes," Marcus said. It was. The immediate crisis appeared to be over. Derek stepped back toward the galley. Priya returned to her station. Phones slowly started lowering. The cabin exhaled, collectively, for the first time in 20 minutes. But Marcus didn't relax. Something outside the window had caught his attention. A thin, amber-colored streak was running beneath the left wing, just past the engine housing. It hadn't been there before. Marcus leaned closer to the glass. The streak was slowly, steadily widening. His calm expression shifted. Not much. Just enough. He pressed the call button. Derek returned, visibly reluctant. "Yes, sir?" Marcus pointed through the window. "There's fluid leaking near the wing." Derek glanced outside for less than a second. "That's probably condensation." Marcus kept his eyes on the stain, watching it spread. "No," he said quietly. "That's not water." Derek sighed. "Mr. Reid, maintenance already completed their inspection." Marcus turned to face him, his voice still calm, but now carrying something sharper underneath it. "Then ask them to inspect it again." Derek hesitated, and in that pause, that single careless pause, the cabin had no idea that an argument over one seat was about to become a matter of every single life on board. Derek glanced through the window again, longer this time. The amber line had widened noticeably beneath the panel near the wing assembly. It caught the light differently than water would, thicker, darker, moving slow like syrup. Priya walked over from the galley. "What is it?" Marcus pointed. "Fluid coming from the wing." Priya leaned over the seat, her breath fogging the glass for a moment. Nobody spoke. Then she straightened. "I'll notify the cockpit." Derek shook his head. "It's probably nothing." Douglas turned toward him. "Probably isn't a safety standard." Derek's mouth closed. Priya picked up the interphone. "Captain, we have a passenger reporting a possible fluid leak near the left wing." A brief pause. Then a voice crackled back through the receiver. "Understood," calling maintenance back to the aircraft. Grant, now sitting stiffly in 3D, twisted around in his seat. "You cannot be serious." "We're delaying the flight again because he saw something out a window." Marcus looked at him. "Would you rather be on time or alive?" "That's dramatic." "No," Marcus said. "Ignoring a possible hydraulic leak would be reckless." Derek looked at him sharply. "How would you even know it's hydraulic fluid?" Marcus paused. The safe answer would have been vague, non-committal. But the stain kept spreading. "I studied aerospace engineering before I moved into finance." Douglas's eyes narrowed with sudden interest. Derek looked unconvinced. Grant let out a dismissive laugh. "Of course you did." Marcus ignored him. Outside, a maintenance truck was already rolling toward the aircraft, the cabin filled with restless motion. Seatbelts clicking open, whispered conversations, phones lifting again. A mechanic boarded a few minutes later, flashlight and inspection kit in hand. His name tag read Devin Castillo. He spoke briefly with the captain, then walked directly to seat 2A. "Sir, can you show me exactly what you saw?" Marcus pointed through the glass. "Started as a thin line beneath that panel. It's been spreading toward the rear." Devin leaned in close, and his expression changed almost instantly, the casual look burning off in seconds. He studied the streak, then the panel, then the surface underneath it. "How long ago did you first notice it?" "About 10 minutes. Devin lifted his radio. "Ground maintenance. I need an external inspection on the left wing. Possible hydraulic fluid near the control surface." Derek shifted uneasily. Grant muttered something under his breath. The cabin waited. The minutes stretched painfully. Then the aircraft door opened again. Devin returned with a second mechanic. Neither man looked relaxed. Devon stopped beside Priya. "We need to deplane everyone now." The words moved through the cabin like a cold draft sliding under a door. Priya stared at him. "Is it confirmed? Hydraulic fluid? Active leak." The cabin went completely silent. Even Grant said nothing. "How serious?" Douglas asked. Devon glanced toward the rows of passengers before answering carefully. "Serious enough that this aircraft is not flying anywhere today." A woman near row 2 pressed a hand to her mouth. The man beside her lowered his head. Derek's face drained of every ounce of color. He looked at Marcus, not with irritation anymore, but with something closer to fear. Devon kept going. "The leak is coming from near the left aileron control system. If the fluid loss had continued mid-flight, it could have compromised control response." Nobody needed a longer explanation than that. The meaning was already clear. The argument over seat 2A had delayed departure. That delay had created time. Time for Marcus to notice the leak. Time for maintenance to catch it on the ground. Time that may very well have protected every single person on that aircraft. Grant looked away first, his shoulders finally losing their rigid posture. Douglas exhaled slowly. Priya gripped the back of the nearest seat for support. Derek said nothing at all. Marcus stayed seated a moment longer, staring through the window. The amber streak looked small from inside the cabin, almost harmless. That, he thought, was exactly the danger of it. Some warnings never arrive loudly. Some truths only emerge from the mouths of people that everyone else has already decided not to listen to. Devon rested a hand briefly on the top of Marcus's seat. "You may have just prevented a serious incident." Marcus looked up at him. "No," he said quietly. "I only pointed out what was already there." Then his eyes moved to Derek. "The real question is why it was so easy for you to dismiss it." Derek lowered his gaze to the floor. Outside, emergency lights began sweeping slowly across the wing. Inside, 140 passengers started gathering their belongings in stunned, careful silence. And for the first time that entire morning, everyone in that cabin understood something at once. Respect was never only a moral issue. Sometimes it was a matter of survival. The passengers filed into the terminal in uneasy quiet. Nobody complained about the delay now. Through the wall of glass, maintenance crews swarmed the grounded aircraft. Flashlights swept beneath the wing. A red safety vehicle idled nearby, its lights turning slowly across the tarmac. Marcus stayed near the gate. Douglas stood beside him, speaking quietly into his phone. Derek and Priya waited near the customer service counter, under the watchful eye of airport management. Neither one looked over at Marcus. Grant kept his distance, staring at the floor. Briefcase clutched to his chest like it might shield him from the phones, still occasionally pointed his way. The confidence that had filled him an hour ago was completely gone. Devon approached with a tablet in hand. "The leak's worse than we first estimated." Douglas ended his call. "How bad?" Devon glanced toward Marcus before answering. "We estimate the system would have lost significant pressure within roughly 40 minutes of takeoff." A heavy silence settled over the group. The scheduled flight time to Seattle had been well over 4 hours. Douglas's face tightened. Would the pilots have maintained control? "They have backup systems," Devon said carefully. "But a developing hydraulic failure at cruise altitude is never something anyone wants to test in real time." The older woman who defended Marcus earlier pressed a hand flat against her chest. A man behind her whispered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Derek finally looked up, his face pale as chalk. "I thought it was condensation." Devon studied him. "You looked for less than a second." Derek opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no argument left to make. Marcus watched him without a trace of satisfaction. He had no interest in humiliating the man. Shame just made people defensive and brittle. Real accountability required something much harder to give. It required honesty. "What happens next?" Marcus asked. Devon looked back toward the grounded plane. It stays here. The Federal Aviation Administration gets the maintenance report. The company inspects every aircraft with a similar hydraulic configuration before any of them go back into service. Douglas nodded. Thank you, Devon. As the mechanic walked off, Douglas turned to Marcus. Mr. Reid, I'd like to speak privately. Marcus glanced around the gate. Passengers were still recording. Employees were whispering into their own phones. Word of the incident had already begun spreading well past the walls of this airport. There's nothing private left about what happened here, Marcus said. Douglas lowered his voice anyway. I understand, but senior leadership needs to know exactly who we're dealing with. Marcus studied him for a long moment. There it was, not what happened. Who we're dealing with. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a slim leather folder, handing Douglas a business card first. Douglas read the name. His breath caught somewhere in his throat. Marcus Reid, founder and chief executive officer, Reid Ashcroft Capital. Douglas looked at the card again, then at Marcus. Reid Ashcroft Capital wasn't simply an investor with deep pockets. It controlled the single largest voting stake in Continental Skyline Holdings, the parent company of Meridian Atlantic Airlines. Douglas knew the numbers. He knew the board structure inside and out. He knew Marcus could call an emergency board session before the sun went down tonight, and every director on that board would show up. You're Marcus Reid, he said quietly. Yes. Derek heard the name. His head lifted sharply. Priya slowly turned from the service desk. Grant froze completely near the window. Douglas's voice dropped further. Why didn't you identify yourself sooner? Because I wanted to know how this airline treats people it doesn't recognize. The words struck harder than anger ever could have. Marcus opened the leather folder. Inside sat months of anonymous audit summaries, complaints, service reports, passenger statements, documented patterns of extra scrutiny, patterns of unequal treatment, patterns the company had spent months quietly filing away as isolated, unrelated incidents. This wasn't my first Meridian Atlantic flight, Marcus said. It was one of many. Douglas scanned the first page, his hand tightening around the folder's edge. You've been investigating us. I've been listening to people your systems chose to ignore. Derek stepped closer, his voice shaking now. Mr. Reid, I didn't know who you were. Marcus turned to face him fully. That's exactly the problem. Derek stopped where he stood. Marcus's tone remained level, controlled, but there was steel underneath it now. You shouldn't need to know my job title before deciding I deserve basic respect. The terminal seemed to grow quieter around all of them. Even the passengers still filming understood something had shifted. This was no longer one man defending one seat. It was hard evidence of a culture that had trained its employees to measure a person's worth before ever offering them basic dignity. Marcus looked out at the grounded aircraft through the window, then back at Douglas. Call Ronald Castellan. Douglas nodded immediately. The chief executive officer? Yes. Marcus placed the audit file into his hands. Tell him to prepare the board. Douglas stared at him. For what? Marcus's eyes moved slowly across Derek, Priya, Grant, and finally the aircraft that had nearly taken off, carrying a hidden, worsening leak. For the truth. His phone had already started buzzing in his pocket, messages stacking up from his legal team, his chief of staff, several members of the board, all of them lighting up his screen at once. The quiet, undercover part of his investigation was over. The reckoning had begun. Ronald Castellan arrived at the airport just under 3 hours later, moving fast through the security corridor with 2 attorneys, the head of corporate safety, and the chair of Meridian Atlantic's board trailing behind him. His tie was loosened. His face was tight with something between panic and dread. Every television screen mounted above the gate was already playing the same clip on a loop. Marcus in seat 2A, Derek standing over him, Grant demanding the seat back. A caption running beneath the footage. Meridian Atlantic passenger dispute exposes alleged discrimination and a dangerous safety failure. The story had already spread far beyond this one airport, racing across every major outlet in the country. Ronald stopped a few feet from Marcus. "Mr. Reid." Marcus stood. The two men shook hands. Ronald had sat across from him in boardrooms plenty of times before, always flanked by advisors, always introduced with careful, rehearsed respect. Today was different. Today Marcus wore a plain gray shirt and carried the same worn backpack the crew had silently judged him for hours earlier. Ronald looked through the terminal glass at the grounded aircraft. "I owe you an apology." Marcus's expression didn't move. "You owe one to every passenger your system has been quietly failing for years." Ronald nodded slowly. "You're right." That answer visibly surprised Douglas. It surprised the attorneys standing behind him. It even caught Marcus slightly off guard. Ronald wasn't making excuses. He wasn't blaming a few rogue employees or calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. He turned toward Derek and Priya, both of them standing near the service desk under the watchful eyes of airport management. "What happened here?" Ronald asked. Derek swallowed hard. "We were trying to accommodate a Platinum Circle passenger. At whose expense?" Derek's eyes flicked toward Marcus. "A confirmed passenger," Ronald continued. "And when that passenger reported a possible mechanical issue," Derek's voice weakened to almost nothing. "I believed it was condensation." "Did you verify it?" "No." That single word carried more weight than any explanation could have. Ronald turned toward Priya. "Did you?" "Not immediately." "Why not?" Priya stared down at the floor. "I think we'd already decided he was being difficult." The honesty cost her something visible. Everyone standing there could see it. Her face tightened as the full meaning of her own sentence settled over her. They had stopped evaluating Marcus's actions somewhere in the middle of all this. They had started evaluating Marcus himself. And once they'd quietly labeled him difficult, every single word out of his mouth got filtered through that judgment, including a warning that could have cost every person on that plane their lives. Marcus stepped closer. "This is exactly how bias works." His voice stayed quiet. It rarely announces itself. It hides inside assumptions. It tells people they're being practical, efficient, loyal to their most important customers. He looked toward the grounded plane through the glass. And then, one day, those same assumptions block information that actually matters. Ronald exhaled slowly. "What are you asking us to do?" Marcus handed him the audit file. "I'm not asking." Ronald looked down at it. Marcus kept going. "Reid Ashcroft controls the largest voting stake in Continental Skyline Holdings. I've already requested an emergency board session." The attorneys exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. Ronald held the file tighter. "What are the terms?" Marcus's voice sharpened. "Immediate inspection of every aircraft with a similar hydraulic configuration." "Already ordered," Ronald said. "An independent review of every discrimination complaint filed in the last 2 years." "Agreed." Passenger status removed entirely from the first stage of any safety report review process. Every concern gets evaluated on its content alone, not on who's raising it. Ronald nodded again. "Agreed. New accountability measures. Not a PR campaign. Not a short mandatory training video nobody actually watches. Real consequences. Real published data. Public progress reports on a schedule, held to the same standard as any other regulatory filing." Ronald looked directly at him. "And leadership." Marcus didn't answer right away. Behind them, passengers watched from behind raised phones. Employees stood frozen near the gate, waiting. The entire future of the company had narrowed down to this single moment in a crowded airport terminal. "Leadership stays," Marcus finally said, "only if leadership accepts full responsibility. No excuses, no quiet settlements, no blaming a handful of frontline employees for a culture that executives allowed to exist for years." Ronald absorbed the words fully, then turned toward the board chair. "Call the meeting." The chair nodded and stepped away, already dialing. Derek's face collapsed. Am I being fired? Marcus looked at him. That decision comes after a fair investigation, not before it. Derek looked genuinely startled by that. After everything, Marcus was still offering him a fairness he himself had never once received. Accountability isn't revenge, Marcus said. It's a chance to tell the truth, repair the damage you caused, and decide who you're going to be after all of this. That choice still belongs to you. Derek lowered his head slowly. Yolanda stood nearby, watching in silence. Ronald faced Marcus again. We'll accept the reforms. You haven't heard all of them yet. I don't need to. Ronald glanced back at the grounded aircraft one more time. We almost sent a damaged plane into the air because our own people stopped listening to a passenger. That cannot happen again. Not ever. His voice broke slightly on the last few words. For the first time that entire day, Marcus saw something in Ronald that went beyond simple corporate fear. He saw actual understanding. The formal meeting happened later that evening, inside a private airline conference suite. Cameras kept outside the doors. Attorneys opened their files. Executives took their seats around a long table. Marcus walked in last. The man they had almost thrown out of first class now sat at the center of the company's most serious crisis in a decade. But he wasn't there to burn Meridian Atlantic to the ground. He was there to force it into becoming an airline actually worthy of the people who trusted it with their lives every single day. 6 months later, the first real results were impossible to ignore. From the outside, Meridian Atlantic looked exactly the same. The planes still carried the same paint job. The gates were still crowded during rush hour. The schedules were still demanding. But inside the company, something fundamental had shifted at the root. Every single employee, from the executives in the top floor offices down to the newest flight attendants finishing training, completed mandatory coursework on unconscious bias, respectful communication, and safety reporting protocols. Customer loyalty status was stripped out entirely from the first screen all employees saw when reviewing any passenger complaint. Every maintenance report, regardless of who submitted it, ran through the exact same inspection pipeline, with no exceptions. Ronald Castellan kept every promise he'd made that day. Monthly progress reports went fully public. Mistakes weren't buried or spun. They were studied, published, and corrected in the open. Derek Holloway returned to work only after completing months of retraining. He no longer worked premium cabins. Instead, he stood in front of new hires every single week, telling them exactly what had happened, with no defense and no excuses. I stopped seeing a passenger, he'd say. I started seeing an assumption that almost cost 140 people their lives. The room always went quiet after that sentence. Priya Anand stayed on with the airline. She accepted full responsibility without ever asking for sympathy in return, and helped redesign the company's entire customer service framework. She often reminded new supervisors that fairness was never measured by how well you treated the easy passengers. It was measured by how you treated the ones nobody expected you to respect. Yolanda Briggs joined the airline's newly formed Employee Advisory Council. Her willingness to speak up when staying quiet would have been so much easier, became a required case study in every leadership training program the company ran going forward. Devin Castillo led a new technical reporting initiative, encouraging every employee and every passenger to flag concerns without fear of being dismissed or embarrassed. One careful eye, one honest observation, one extra inspection nobody wanted to bother with. Sometimes that really was the entire difference between routine and disaster. Grant Whitfield disappeared from the headlines within a few weeks. His business slowed for a while, and something else changed even faster. Months after the incident, he sat down and wrote Marcus a handwritten letter, no excuses inside it. Just one sentence that stood out above the rest. I confused privilege with character, and I paid the price for it. Marcus never wrote back. He didn't need to. The lesson belonged entirely to Grant now, and it was his to carry. Early one autumn morning, Marcus boarded another Meridian Atlantic flight. Once again he wore simple clothes. Once again he carried the same worn backpack. No assistant, no announcement. Nobody on the plane recognized him. A young gate agent smiled warmly as he walked past. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard." A flight attendant helped an elderly woman lift her bag into the overhead bin before greeting every single passenger down the aisle with the exact same patience. Nobody was rushed. Nobody was skipped. Nobody was quietly sized up and found wanting. Halfway through boarding, a little boy pressed his face to the window and tugged gently on his mother's sleeve. "I think something looks funny under the wing." The nearest flight attendant crouched down beside him without hesitation. "Thank you for telling me." She immediately called the captain. Maintenance came back out to check. The inspection found nothing unusual. The flight departed safely a short while later. Nobody laughed at the boy. Nobody dismissed him because of his age. Nobody asked whether he flew often enough to have earned the right to be taken seriously. Marcus looked out the window as the aircraft climbed into the pale morning sky, and a quiet smile crossed his face. He had never really fought for seat 2A. He had fought for something far bigger than that. The right of every single person to be treated with the same basic dignity, regardless of what they wore, or what they carried, or what card they didn't feel the need to show. The belief that respect should always come before status. The understanding that the smallest, quietest voice in the room can sometimes be the one thing standing between everyone and disaster. Real leadership, Marcus had come to understand, was never about reminding people how powerful you were. It was about building a culture strong enough that nobody ever needed that kind of power just to be treated fairly in the first place. Some victories only change a single day. Others quietly change the way people choose to see one another for the rest of their lives. This was one of the second kind.